technology. So I was going to say, this is a tremendous series of talks that Barry Bluestone has arranged, and I was going to say I don't think that normally you get to hear as much of him as you did tonight, but and I'll bet it was a pleasure too. I heard you laughing. I don't think you'll laugh very much at what I have to say tonight, because I'm talking about, well, why minority kids attend less successful schools in Boston and in the United States. So it's a dismal topic, and yet one that's very important, and I think it's important to get different slants on this question. A lot of research about educational opportunities has to do with trying to track individual children and understand why some kids do better and some kids do worse. And the current, I guess, popular theme is how come black kids do worse even if they come from good families and are in good schools? So that's one way of thinking about the issues. I'm looking more at the question of why minority kids go to bad schools in the first place. And I take it for granted that the quality of the school environment, the kinds of children that you're around, make a difference for every child in terms of their outcomes. Certainly, all of my friends would agree that it's important to choose where to live based on what school your children are going to go to. And now mine are out of college now, but now I'm worried about where my grandchildren are going to go to school. I think it makes a big difference. And so I'm interested in the question now, not of how kids do once they get there, but which school are they assigned to based on where they live? What is the opportunity structure that they're faced with? And so that's a different question than how do they do. It's a prior question. And so I call it the geography of inequality. Really simply, what kinds of schools are different kids going to? And the answer is quite different. And what I am amazed by is how great the disparities are. It would be possible to know that there's some minority kids in central city schools in the Bronx or somewhere that those schools aren't doing very well, and to figure that that is a problem. But if it is the typical problem of the average kid, then it's not just that kind of a problem. It's a systematic concern. And what I want to do tonight is just to give you some reasons to believe that it is a very systematic concern. It's not a few schools and a few kids, but it is pretty much across the board typical experience kind of a problem. And the kind of conclusion that it leads me to is that if one were serious about dealing with it, if in fact we believed in equal educational opportunities in this country, then none of the ideas that we have on the board now about how to deal with it are going to make very much difference. For example, desegregation of school districts is not going to make very much difference. If you closed the worst 10% of schools and managed somehow by a miracle to get the kids in those schools into average schools, it wouldn't make much of a difference, because the volume of the problem is so deep. Okay, so that's where I end up. You may not agree with me with that conclusion, but let me give you some information. This is I do the kind of research that you get data on all the schools in America, and then try to analyze it, put it together systematically. So what I'm talking to you right now about nationally, it's about all the public schools in the country for which it was possible to get data. So tens of thousands of schools. It's not every school, not every state, but it's most of them. And then later I'm going to talk about Boston, the Boston region, because actually I could talk about anywhere in the country, any major metropolitan area, and it would be the same story, but I think it does have a particular meaning when I'm in a Boston audience and you're thinking about what do you know about schools in the region, and to what extent do the data patterns that I show you match what you know. So I've taken the statewide test scores in every state. They all have different tests. Some of them are hard tests and some are easy tests, and it's very difficult to compare across states. But what I've done is I've taken every school and asked, what is its percentile of performance compared to the other schools at its level in the same state? So the meaning of being in the, I don't know, some of your children are in the 99th percentile on some standardized tests. I'll bet they are. If your son's at Northwestern, I'll bet he was in something. So the 99th percentile means more or less the same thing in every state. Being at the 10th or the 20th percentile of schools means pretty much the same thing in each state, even though the test scores aren't exactly comparable. So what I show on this table is the average white kid, and I've got it circled, the elementary school reading, because I don't want to spend time to talk about every one, it's redundant. Let's just talk about the reading test for elementary kids. The average white kid is in a public elementary school that's at the 60th, 59th percentile of the ranking of all schools. So, better than average school by a good bit. The average black kid is in a school that's at the 35th percentile. The average Hispanic kid at the 38th percentile. So you see, this is the magnitude of difference in terms of what's the performance of the kids in the school that these children are going to. And it's a big difference. If you have the choice of sending your kid to a school that's better than average by 10 points, or worse than average by 15 or 20 points, I know what you would do. You would perceive it as a very big difference. And this is the average kid. So the average kid among whites, the average is at the 60th percentile. That means that the distribution, more or less, is that most of them are at schools at a little below average, maybe the 40th, 45th, up to the 70th or 75th or so. That's the range. If the average black kid is at a school that's at the 35th percentile, that means that most of them are somewhere between the 15th and the 50th. They're, like most kids are in below average schools, and it goes down, a lot of them are way down toward the bottom of the distribution. So this is the essential overall disparity that I am beginning with, and I want to look a little closer to understand where does it come from, why. Notice that in the middle school level and the high school level, it's about the same story. And the math scores and the reading scores, it's not so different. So why do they attend bad schools? Is it because they're in the central city? Is it because they're in high poverty schools, or it's some combination of these two things? Now, central city schools have taken a beating in the public imagination. They say, oh yeah, the city schools, no, we want to go to the suburbs. If you're in the suburbs, then it'll be okay. And I'm going to show you some results that suggest that it's not so simple as that. There's actually a lot of evidence that children in schools with high poverty concentrations do worse. And in fact, what I will show you is that schools with high poverty concentrations, on average, the kids do worse, and the schools are worse performers. But some combination of the location and the poverty concentration ought to go a long way toward explaining the differences. So now what I'm going to show you, let's just look at, well, we could look at, there's a lot of numbers in this chart, right? And I'm going to ask you to look at a lot of numbers, but I'm going to take the time to explain what I see as the pattern in those numbers. so that you'll believe that the data is actually there, but my story about it may be what you remember. So, for example, if we only look at kids who are in high poverty schools, and the criterion we used is something like 65% of the kids are eligible for free and reduced price lunch programs. So those are high poverty schools, and they are found in cities and in suburbs and in non-metropolitan areas. One of the surprises for some people would be how many suburbs are high poverty schools. But suburbia today is highly differentiated. There are suburban ghettos. There are, well, we'll see. There's some old industrial towns, white working class, and are now very Hispanic, and they're high poverty places outside of the city. And the metropolitan area has a group of inner that don't match today what people think of as the suburban. And we only look at schools in the suburbs. So now let's, narrow it down. These are kids that they have in common high poverty school in the suburbs. So I've highlighted this column here. And if they're white kids in high poverty suburban schools, they're in a school that's at the 58th percentile on, this is the elementary reading test. So actually, not so different from white kids' schools everywhere. And kids at the 29th percentile, Hispanics at the 32nd. So in fact, if you were only to look at this one column of data, and of course there's a lot more in the table, we could say, well, the initial story about elementary reading tests, big disparities, when we control for poverty concentration and we put them in the suburbs altogether, the answer is it's just about the same. Now, it's not totally the same. In fact, on average, a little bit, suburban schools rank higher, controlling for everything else we know about them, rank a little higher in the test score outcomes. Low poverty schools rank much higher than high poverty schools. But the thing is that among this group of schools, minority kids are in very different ones than white kids, and they're worse. And I'm interested in and why are they worse? What makes them so worser? So one way that I've approached this is trying to get a better idea of what kinds of schools there are in terms of poverty and location and some other characteristics, because to the extent that all we have to think about is, there's the bad city schools and the good suburban schools, or the bad poverty schools and the good, more affluent schools. And these simple images aren't quite enough to capture the differences that there are in the kinds of schools that kids are in. And so we did what we call a cluster analysis. Now, this is a wonderful thing. Social scientists have copied the science model, and we can take a whole bunch of characteristics of anything, in this case schools, and throw them into a computer, and the computer figures out from it what are the categories of kinds of schools that, if you create those categories, the schools within the category are very similar to each other, and they're very different from the schools in a different category. That's called a cluster analysis. And hardly any of us understands exactly how it works. Right? But if you run it, there are some statistical criteria that you can use to decide when you have a good solution. This is our best solution. And it suggests that there are 7 kinds of schools in America. This is just elementary schools. Cluster 1, well, if you look at the average characteristics of these schools, the schools in Cluster 1, that's this column, we see that, well, they're 75% white on average. That's sort of pretty white, but actually not that far from the percent white in all American public schools. And it includes some black and Hispanic population and even some Asians, so somewhat racially mixed, diverse. They tend to be in the suburbs. 70% are in the suburbs. Actually, something is wrong here. These numbers have been rounded. Those are probably both about 15%. So there's some rounding that went on here. The average poverty rate in the school, 26.5%. If we look across the row, we see 26.5%, not bad. Because there's some categories that it's more like 60 or 65%. No, 26.5% is not bad. And actually that's something that I was surprised by as I began to work with these data. In fact, the average white kid is in a school that's 30% poor. And when I saw that, I thought, oh my God, so poor. But the average black or Hispanic kid is in a school that's 65% poor. And believe me, it blew me away. I mean, 65, this disparity, I was shocked. I grew up in schools with less poverty than that. And so to say, well, what the average is for even relatively privileged white kids. Anyway, 26.5%, not bad. And foreign-born, kind of a moderate level. So I call that suburban whites, racially mixed, low poverty, moderately high foreign-born. Okay, that's a type. So that's a kind of a complicated type and one that we don't have in mind. Suburban, low poverty, but racially mixed. Actually, that sounds like a good thing. We should create more of this kind of school in America, right? Diversity, we value that. Low poverty, that's a great thing. Suburban, it couldn't be too bad. Let me look at a couple of the other clusters. Cluster 4 is one that I think you'll find familiar by contrast. In cluster 4, these schools on average are 69% black kids, but there's a white minority. 66% poverty rate, more concentrated in the city, but also found in suburban and non-metropolitan areas. Well, so this is the representative of the really black American school on average. And there's another type here, number 3, that's 33% black and 48% Hispanic on average, and also very high poverty, and also more predominantly in central cities. This is another type of school, and it's sort of a new type in America. We used to think it was a black and white country, but it's Hispanic too now. Not just in Arizona or Southern California or the border in Texas, but overall. And so the black Hispanic school that's also high poverty in the city is another type. And as you could guess, it will turn out not to be such a great type. But what is another category I think is quite interesting? The last one, category 7, which is distinctive because it's the only one with an appreciable Native American population. And you'll notice that a very large share of them are, metropolitan areas, so these are rural, Native American, high poverty schools. So it's another type to have in mind. So when we think about what are the kinds of schools in America and try to translate that into, is this the one you want your kid in, or the one, which is the good one, the bad one? These are the types that I have in mind. There is, of course, somewhere in here must be the very, very white, very, very not poor. Oh, category 2. So some different types. Now, what I've done is just count up all. What percent of the black kids are in each type? And what percent of the Hispanic kids are in each type? And the white kids, what percent of them are? Now this is the what kind of schools are then different kids in, and so it turns out most black kids, 32 plus 36 in your head, it's more than 2/3 of them are in category 3. Urban Hispanic, very high poverty, extreme poverty. 2/3 are type. What percent of white kids are in those kinds of schools? Some. There's a distribution. 10% of them. Where Hispanic students, nearly 2/3 are in third cluster. That's Hispanic and black. Very high poverty, very high percent foreign born. It's a type of school. A big majority of Hispanic kids are in that kind of school. Native American kids, more than 2/3 are in cluster 7. That was the non-metropolitan, high poverty, but surprisingly high shares of Native Americans in those schools, and that's where in America they are going. Asian kids, what's that? Suburban, racially mixed, high percent Asian, low poverty, high percent foreign born. Well, and if they're not white and racially mixed, low poverty, the Asian kids generally, not always, but on the whole, Asian kids are in schools that are racially mixed, a high share of white fellow students and low poverty rates, tending towards suburban. This is not for all kids, but it's the largest share. So who's going to what kinds of schools? This is the answer. I'm going to turn to the Boston region to make it more close to home. What is this? I don't think that I put this map on here, did I? Somebody added it for me? Thank you. But it lists the names of the school districts? Is there a Lincoln School District and a Weston and town names? Okay, so this is the Boston region. Great. Okay. So what do I want you to see? Actually, that's just a lot of numbers, and what it says is the region as a whole is very racially diverse, is becoming more diverse. Okay, so we got plenty of black, Hispanic, and Asian young people. And they live pretty segregated from one another. This is the most recent something we call index of dissimilarity. It's a summary measure of the degree of segregation. Johannesburg, during apartheid, had a value of 90. It ranges from 0 to 100. So Johannesburg was 90. Many American cities in the 60s were at about 80. 66 is a value that suggests that if you wanted to equalize the distribution of people across neighborhoods, 2/3 of the black population would have to move from disproportionately black neighborhoods to black neighborhoods in order to create that equalization. It's a very high number, and the thing about it, if there was something we're going to disturb you, is in 1980 this measure was 75, in 1990 68, 66, 66. What's disturbing is it's so persistent. That is, whatever we've achieved in terms of housing, civil rights legislation, anti-discrimination, black middle class, white attitudes about their neighbors, who are you willing to live next to, however much all of that may have changed in a 30-year period, it's not resulting in very much change on the ground. Blacks and whites, Hispanics and whites are living very separate from one another, and Asians not so much so, but also rather ethnically clustered. And so the average, well, that's the story. There's the residential segregation. You're not surprised that there is residential segregation, but I'll bet you're surprised that it's not changing. I'll bet you thought that things were going to get better. You know, even if you didn't buy into America because Obama was elected, you thought that there was progress on the ground. And I'm sorry to tell you that since 1990 in the Boston region, I don't see it. And this just takes the child population, kids under 18, and shows just a map of where they are in the region. And, well, very highly concentrated. They're in Boston. They're in a few old industrial towns. And much of the space of the region is less than 5% black and Hispanic. Suburban Boston, actually, it's where most of the people live. It's where the great majority of the white population lives, and actually not many black and Hispanic kids live in those areas. So this is a map that just represents visually the statistic I gave you before, that highly separated. And where the, like here, where it's the black color means more than 50% black and Hispanic kids. And they live in the worst neighborhoods, but I'm a little bit late. I don't want to keep you too long on just all these numbers. This is about the public schools. So I got data from the National Center for Education Statistics on who was in all the schools in the country, and I took the Boston metropolitan area, and what this shows is the region is very diverse. I've highlighted in blue. Not so different from the national American population. A white majority, significant black and Hispanic minorities, actually a growing Asian population. But if we compare Boston and the other what I'm calling cities, these are the old industrial mill towns around, and what I'm calling the suburbs, well, they're quite different. And this reflects the map, but now these are the data that's behind that map. Boston is almost 50% black in its public elementary schools and almost 30% Hispanic. But Boston suburbs are 3% black and 4% Hispanic. And if you look at the number of kids involved, how many white kids, this is in the year 1999-2000, were in the Boston public elementary schools, 5,000. Well, it's not very many when you consider 273,000 in the suburban schools. Like, in fact, it almost doesn't matter, Boston, in terms of the white population. You could have a totally desegregated Boston school system, but the region as a whole would be still heavily tilted toward a minority city and white suburbs. That doesn't really matter. Well, it matters politically and it matters to people who live in the city, but in terms of the impact it makes on the overall pattern, what happens within Boston isn't that significant. And the levels of segregation. This is, instead of comparing people by neighborhood, it's comparing kids by school. and the overall level of segregation for black versus white kids in elementary schools or Hispanic versus white kids in elementary schools, these figures are about the same as we saw in terms of residential patterns. And in fact, school segregation reflects exactly the residential patterns, but it's not so much within Boston or within suburban school districts, but between them. There's very big boundaries here between the city schools, the old industrial satellite town schools, and suburban schools. And, well, this is the map that shows where the kids are. So where are the school districts that are 50% or more black and Hispanic? It's the Boston City District, Brockton, Lawrence, is that Cambridge? Is this Cambridge or is this Cambridge? I think that's Boston. Okay, so this is Cambridge and Somerville here in that 25 to 50% category. But school, look at them. Most of them less than 5%. So that's the background here, and we can also calculate the percent poverty levels in the schools that kids go to. White kids on average, well, they do better in Boston region than in the nation as a whole. On average, they're in schools with poverty level. That's great. But black and Hispanic kids are almost at the same level of poverty in this region as in the nation. And it's particularly high in the city of Boston, and quite low in the suburbs. I'd like you to, now I'm going to go back to the suburbs and look at all that area that's white, and there's very few black and Hispanic kids there, but which particular suburban school districts are they in, or which particular schools are they in? And white kids on average are in suburbs where their school is 12% poor. In the suburbs, black kids are in schools that's 25% poor, and Hispanics 41%. It's not the same schools. There's a degree of school segregation within suburban school districts, and that segregation is placing even within those districts, which probably they see themselves as desegregated officially, reasonably balanced and so on, but nevertheless, they're in different schools, and schools with different implications for school performance. Test scores, well, I'm going to skip this in the interest of time. Believe me, the national pattern shows up in Boston. White kids, on average, in schools with very high performance. Black kids and Hispanic kids, not so good. But here's what I think you'll find more interesting. We have an online map system. It's called U.S. Schools. If you went to s4.brown.edu, S4 is my program, at brown.edu, s4.brown.edu/US schools, there is a web-based map that can show you anywhere in the country, and I took this off my computer yesterday. And here's what's being shown. In the background, different colors are the school districts, school district boundaries. And then every triangle or square or circle is a school, different levels. The triangles are elementary schools, the circles are junior high schools, the squares are high schools. And then I've graded them by whether they're at the 60th percentile or higher. No, 70th percentile or higher, at the 30th or lower, or in between. So the green ones are the ones that are in the 70th percentile or better. And the red ones are caution, below the 30th percentile, and the brown ones are in between. And I have some schools that are in black. There's no data for those particular schools for some reason. I don't know. The state failed to provide information. So what's the pattern geographically here? Where are the red schools and where are the green schools? What do you see? Not such a simple pattern. It'd be really simple if the red schools were in the city and all the green ones were in the suburbs, and you say, oh, that's the thing we're familiar with. But no, it is a little more complicated. There's a number of areas outside the city. This is around Lowell, and this is around, am I reading correctly, Lawrence? And this down here, is that Brockton? And so there's some little clusters of red schools outside the city also. But then there's this swath, I don't know how to describe it exactly, a kind of a nice swath around the city of consistently good schools. Now I've also used the colors in the background to identify the racial composition of the school district, of the kids in the school district at the elementary level. And so the variable is the percent non-Hispanic white among the kids. This purple color down here is 95% or more white, and then some less purpley colors that are majority white, and districts with very few whites are in these pink and yellow colors. So I wonder whether you can see any association here between the racial composition of the district and whether the schools are green or red. And it can take a while to keep the pattern. Low-performing schools in places that you wouldn't expect them, and there's high-performing schools. Boston, look, there's a high-performing. And in fact, one of the nice things about this web application is there's a little tool that allows you to click on one of the triangles and bring up a little page that tells you the name of the school and gives you information about that school. And say, because what explains the exception? And if you knew the name of the school, and if you know Boston, I wouldn't be surprised if you said, oh yeah, that's a good school. Well, I don't know why, but you'd also find that although it might be a relatively high poverty school, it would also likely be a school that is disproportionately white compared to other schools. It is the general pattern. And we can zoom in a little bit more, and you can see better. I couldn't put the roads in on this. I didn't think we'd be able to see it so well. But here is that school, elementary school. I'll bet one of you knows, given its location, what school that is. But most of the schools in the Boston city are, Quincy. In fact, you're right, because I did look it up, and it is Quincy. But I don't know anything about, I don't know Quincy, right? Yeah. In Chinatown? Yeah, okay. And, okay. So this is the story. Minority kids are in unsuccessful schools because our residential patterns remain so very highly segregated, and because school district boundaries have been drawn in a way that reinforces those lines of segregation. As a result, our school systems are very segregated, even when in Boston there was a great effort to desegregate the system, and the level of segregation within Boston is much lower than it used to be. Nevertheless, the region as a whole, because of the boundaries between districts, remain very, very separate. And because the racial composition and the poverty concentrations in schools are so closely associated with each other, it's natural that the test score results in schools would also be so vastly unequal. Now, what conclusion could I draw from it? Here's one possible conclusion. These schools are doing bad because they've got so many minority kids in them. So I did an analysis where the dependent variable is how well does the individual school do, and I used as predictors some characteristics of the school. And in fact, it turns out that the more black kids and the more Hispanic kids in the school, controlling for other things, the worse the school did. Also, and a stronger effect was the greater the poverty concentration of the school, regardless of its racial composition. This was a stronger effect, the worse the school did. I've moved away from I got this one, but not that one. Sorry. Yeah. And so, in addition, it turned out that city schools did a little worse. Large schools did a little better. Schools with more immigrant kids controlling for everything else actually did better. So immigrant is a positive factor. Schools with more districts where more families were headed by a single woman parent did worse. So there's a lot of things in here that are contributing. And a piece of it is the racial composition, and I don't know what the right answer is why. I don't think we know whether we put these same kids in different schools, whether they would perform better. But I believe that they would because I know that the poverty concentration operates independently of the racial composition. And the poverty concentration is a larger predictor of the outcomes in the school. So if I were a gambling person, if I were gambling by, for example, making sure what's be my guess, I wouldn't really the poverty concentration. So that brings me to the point where I think I can open it up. We've got still 35 minutes.
Yeah, and I think what we'll do is we'll take this our normal 5-minute break, okay, and we'll come back for questions and answers.
Okay.
Thank you very much.